Stephen stood frozen for a moment, his boss's words echoing in his head. Don't look at me like that. He hadn't meant to look at her in any particular way, or had he? When he finally stepped out of her office, he found himself replaying the conversation, trying to recall the exact way his eyes had met hers. Vivian Morgan was a woman of power, grace, and an air of mystery that Stephen had always admired. At 38, she carried herself with a confidence that was both intimidating and captivating. As her assistant, he had spent the last 2 years watching her navigate the corporate world with a level of control he found inspiring. But he had never considered that his admiration might be showing in ways he didn't intend. Had his gaze lingered too long? Was there something in his eyes that made her uncomfortable? Or had she felt something she wasn't ready to acknowledge? He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair as he settled at his desk. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe she had just been having a bad day. But deep down, a part of him wasn't convinced. The truth was, Stephen had noticed her in ways that weren't entirely professional. He admired the way she spoke, the way she handled challenges, the rare moments when she laughed, moments he had come to crave. It wasn't just about respect anymore. There was something more, something unspoken. And maybe, just maybe, Vivian had noticed too. The next few days were filled with tension. Vivian kept their interactions strictly professional, barely meeting Stephen's gaze during meetings or casual conversations. If she was avoiding him, she was doing a damn good job of it. Stephen, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Had she really been offended, or was she trying to suppress something between them? One evening, as he was preparing to leave the office, he noticed Vivian still in her office, staring at her laptop with an expression that suggested frustration. He hesitated at her door before finally knocking. "Come in," she said, not looking up. Stephen stepped inside and waited until she finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "If I made you uncomfortable the other day, that wasn't my intention." Vivian sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Stephen, you're a great assistant. You've been professional, hardworking, and reliable. But lately, I've noticed the way you look at me." Stephen swallowed. "And how is that?" She exhaled sharply, as if debating whether to say it. "Like I'm a woman, not just your boss." A charged silence filled the room. She wasn't wrong, but hearing her say it made the air between them feel heavier. "And is that a problem?" he asked carefully. Vivian studied him for a long moment before standing up. "It is if we let it be." She walked toward the window, looking out at the city lights. "I've worked hard to build my career, Stephen. I can't afford distractions." He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Maybe it's not a distraction. Maybe it's something worth acknowledging." She turned, and for the first time, she didn't hide behind professionalism. There was something raw in her eyes, something that mirrored what he felt. "This conversation ends here," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Stephen gave her a slow nod. "For now." And then, without another word, he left, knowing this was far from over. The air between them shifted after that night. Neither of them spoke about their conversation, but the weight of it lingered in every glance, every unspoken word, every accidental brush of hands. Stephen tried to act normal, keeping his interactions with Vivian strictly professional, but the way she avoided holding his gaze for too long only made it clearer. She wasn't unaffected. One evening, a company gala brought them together outside the office. The event was held at an upscale hotel, the room buzzing with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Stephen arrived in a tailored black suit, but his focus was on only one thing, Vivian. And when she entered, wearing a deep red dress that hugged her in all the right places, his breath caught. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Several executives and clients gravitated toward her, drawn to her confidence and beauty. He watched as she laughed at something a middle-aged investor said, but there was something in her body language, stiff, polite, but distant. Then, her eyes met his across the room. For a moment, the world around them faded. And then she looked away. Stephen exhaled and made his way to the bar, ordering a whiskey. He wasn't the jealous type, but something about seeing her entertain meaningless conversations with other men irritated him more than it should have. "Enjoying the evening?" a familiar voice asked. He turned to find Vivian beside him, her expression unreadable. "I suppose," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "And you?" "I'm used to these events," she said, glancing around. "They're all the same." Stephen smirked. "You look like you were having fun a minute ago." She arched a brow. "Are you watching me, Stephen?" He chuckled. "Hard not to." Vivian's lips parted slightly, and for a split second, he saw the hesitation, the inner war she was fighting. But instead of pulling away, she did something unexpected.
She leaned in.
"Meet me on the terrace in 10 minutes, she whispered. Then she walked away, leaving him standing there, heart pounding. This was dangerous, reckless. But when the time came, he knew one thing for sure: he would go. Vivian had always prided herself on control, over her career, her emotions, and the way she handled people. But Stephen had been testing the limits of that control, without even knowing it. At first, she dismissed it as simple admiration. He was young, ambitious, and undeniably charming, but she had worked with attractive men before without issue. Yet, something about him unsettled her in ways she refused to acknowledge. It was the way he listened, really listened. When she spoke in meetings, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity that made her feel seen, not just as a boss, but as a woman. It was the way he anticipated her needs before she even voiced them, the way he paid attention to details others overlooked. It was the rare moments when he let his professionalism slip, flashing a teasing grin, or making a remark that sent warmth curling through her stomach before she could push it down. She had tried to fight it. She started keeping their conversations brief, sticking strictly to business. She avoided unnecessary eye contact, knowing that every time their gazes locked, she felt an unsettling flutter in her chest. She reminded herself that she was almost 40, that he was 10 years younger, and that this was nothing more than misplaced attraction. But her resolve wavered in the quiet moments, the times when she caught him looking at her with something unreadable in his dark eyes. When he leaned just a little too close while handing her a file. When his scent, a mix of cedarwood and something unmistakably him, lingered after he left her office. Then one afternoon, it happened again. Stephen had been standing by her desk, discussing a report, when she looked up and caught him staring. It wasn't an ordinary stare. It was deep, searching, filled with something she wasn't ready to name. A warmth spread through her, unsettling and exhilarating all at once. That was when she snapped. "Don't look at me like that." The words had escaped before she could stop them, harsher than she intended. But she had to say them, had to put distance between them before she lost control completely. Because if she didn't, she wasn't sure what would happen next. Vivian had always prided herself on control, over her career, her emotions, and the way she handled people. But Stephen had been testing the limits of that control, without even knowing it. At first, she dismissed it as simple admiration. He was young, ambitious, and undeniably charming, but she had worked with attractive men before without issue. Yet, something about him unsettled her in ways she refused to acknowledge. It was the way he listened, really listened. When she spoke in meetings, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity that made her feel seen, not just as a boss, but as a woman. It was the way he anticipated her needs before she even voiced them, the way he paid attention to details others overlooked. It was the rare moments when he let his professionalism slip, flashing a teasing grin, or making a remark that sent warmth curling through her stomach before she could push it down. She had tried to fight it. She started keeping their conversations brief, sticking strictly to business. She avoided unnecessary eye contact, knowing that every time their gazes locked, she felt an unsettling flutter in her chest. She reminded herself that she was almost 40, that he was 10 years younger, and that this was nothing more than misplaced attraction. But her resolve wavered in the quiet moments, the times when she caught him looking at her with something unreadable in his dark eyes. When he leaned just a little too close while handing her a file. When his scent, a mix of cedarwood and something unmistakably him, lingered after he left her office. Then one afternoon, it happened again. Stephen had been standing by her desk, discussing a report, when she looked up and caught him staring. It wasn't an ordinary stare. It was deep, searching, filled with something she wasn't ready to name. A warmth spread through her, unsettling and exhilarating all at once. That was when she snapped. "Don't look at me like that." The words had escaped before she could stop them, harsher than she intended. But she had to say them, had to put distance between them before she lost control completely. Because if she didn't, she wasn't sure what would happen next. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of city life below as Stephen stepped onto the terrace. A soft glow from the hotel's garden lights cast long shadows, and beyond the stone railing, the skyline stretched endlessly. But his focus was on only one thing.
Vivian.
She stood near the edge, her back to him, her red dress hugging her silhouette as the wind teased loose strands of her hair. For a moment, he just watched her, letting the weight of what was about to happen settle in his chest. "You came," she said, her voice calm but laced with something else, uncertainty, maybe even anticipation. "You knew I would." She exhaled, turning slightly to face him. Even in the dim light, he could see the conflict in her eyes. "This is reckless," she murmured. "Then why did you ask me to come?" he countered, stepping closer. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him, as if searching for an escape. But there wasn't one, not from this, not from what was growing between them. "Stephen," her voice was softer now, uncertain. "This isn't supposed to happen." He reached out then, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "But it is happening." She closed her eyes for a brief second, as if trying to summon the control she always prided herself on. But when she opened them again, that control was slipping. "I've tried to ignore this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tried to remind myself that I'm older, that I'm your boss, that this is dangerous." He took another step, eliminating the space between them. "And did any of that work?" A faint, breathless laugh escaped her lips.
No.
His fingers brushed against her wrist, a simple touch, but the way her breath hitched told him everything he needed to know. "I don't want to pretend anymore," Stephen said, his voice low and deliberate. Vivian searched his face, as if looking for a reason to push him away. But when she found none, she did something he hadn't expected. She reached up, hesitated for only a moment, then let her fingers graze along his jaw. "You make me feel things I shouldn't," she confessed. His heart pounded. "Then feel them." For the first time, she didn't pull away. And in that quiet moment, under the city lights, the lines between them blurred. Vivian's fingers trembled slightly as they rested against Stephen's jaw. It was such a simple touch, yet it carried the weight of everything she had tried to deny. She should step back. She should remind herself that this was a mistake. But she didn't. Instead, she let her hand slide down to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his suit. It matched her own, fast, unsteady, filled with something dangerous. Stephen lifted a hand and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was soft, reverent, as if he was afraid she would disappear if he moved too quickly. "Tell me to leave, Vivian." She parted her lips, ready to say the words. But nothing came out, because she didn't want him to leave. She had spent too many nights lying awake, telling herself that what she felt for him was nothing, that it was just admiration, attraction, fleeting, meaningless. But standing here, with his warmth so close, with his eyes searching hers like he already knew the war raging inside her, she couldn't lie anymore. "I can't," she admitted. A slow, knowing smile tugged at his lips. "Then don't." His hand moved to her waist, not forceful, just enough to make her feel the heat of his touch through the fabric of her dress. Her body betrayed her, leaning into him despite the voice in her head warning her to stop. "This is madness," she whispered, but her hands were already gripping his lapels, anchoring herself to him. "Maybe," he murmured, his breath brushing against her cheek. "But tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away." Vivian didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, closing the final inch between them. The moment their lips met, It was like releasing a dam that had been threatening to burst for months. The kiss was slow at first, uncertain, both of them testing the limits of what was allowed. But then Stephen deepened it, his hand pressing against the small of her back, and suddenly, there were no limits. No rules. Just them. A soft sigh escaped her, and Stephen swallowed it greedily, his lips moving with a hunger that sent a shiver down her spine. She clung to him, letting herself feel everything, the heat, the longing, the sheer madness of it all. When they finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against his, both of them breathless. "This changes everything," she whispered. Stephen's fingers traced slow circles against her waist.
"Yeah,
"It does." She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to gather the pieces of her shattered restraint. "We need to think about what happens next." He smiled, brushing a thumb over her lips. "I already know what I want to happen next." Vivian let out a soft, breathless laugh, shaking her head. "You don't make this easy, do you?" Stephen grinned. "Not when it comes to you." The city lights flickered around them, but neither of them moved, caught in the quiet, dangerous moment that had changed everything. And neither of them wanted it to end. The terrace was silent except for the faint sounds of traffic below, but inside Vivian's head, there was nothing but noise. She had kissed him. Not in a moment of weakness, not in a slip of judgment, but because she had wanted to. And now, standing in the cool night air with Stephen's arms still loosely wrapped around her waist, she felt the weight of what they had just done. "I should go," she murmured, though she made no effort to move. Stephen's fingers traced lazy circles against her hip, his touch light but possessive. "Is that what you really want?" She sighed, stepping back just enough to put space between them. It took every ounce of willpower not to lean back into him. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know this isn't simple." Stephen studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Vivian, I don't care about the rules. I don't care about the age difference or the office politics. I care about this." He gestured between them. "And I know you do too." She exhaled, rubbing her temple. "It's not that easy." "Then let's make it easy," he said, stepping closer. "Tell me what you're afraid of." Vivian met his gaze, and for the first time, she let herself be honest. "I've spent years building my career, Stephen. I can't afford to have people questioning my judgment because She stopped herself. "Because you what?" he pressed. She swallowed hard. "Because I have feelings for you." A slow smile spread across his lips, as if he had just won a battle she didn't even know she was fighting. Vivian shook her head, trying to gather her thoughts. "People will talk. They'll assume I'm with some young assistant?" Stephen finished, his tone laced with amusement. "Vivian, you don't owe anyone an explanation for who you want." She sighed. "It's not that simple." Stephen reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then let's take it one step at a time." She looked down at their joined hands, her heart pounding. "And what if this is a mistake?" He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Then let's make it the best mistake we've ever made." A laugh bubbled past her lips, unexpected and soft. He always had a way of making things seem so easy, so right. Vivian wasn't sure where this was going. She wasn't even sure how to navigate the risks. But as she looked into Stephen's eyes, she knew one thing. She wasn't ready to walk away.
Not yet.
Vivian knew she should have walked away that night. Should have left Stephen standing on that terrace before she did something even more reckless. But instead, she found herself lingering, trapped in the warmth of his gaze, in the way his fingers still held hers, as if letting go would shatter something fragile between them. When she finally forced herself to take a step back, Stephen let her go, but not before running his thumb over her knuckles in a slow, deliberate stroke that sent a shiver up her spine. "I should go," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Stephen nodded, but there was something knowing in his smirk. "I'll see you Monday, boss." His voice was teasing, but the way he said it low, intimate, made her stomach tighten. She turned before she could let herself react, walking swiftly back inside the ballroom, back to the world where she was Vivian Morgan, the composed, untouchable executive. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt different. Her skin still tingled from his touch. Her lips still burned from the kiss. And her mind? It was a mess. Monday morning. Vivian arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to regain some sense of normalcy. She buried herself in work, double-checking reports, reviewing contracts, anything to push Stephen out of her mind. But it was useless. The moment he walked in, she knew everything had changed. "Good morning," he said casually as he placed a folder on her desk. She looked up, intending to greet him the way she always had, but the second their eyes met, she saw it. That damn smirk. That knowing, confident look that said, "I know you haven't stopped thinking about me." Vivian swallowed and forced herself to act normal. "Morning. Did you finalize the quarterly projections?" Stephen leaned against the desk, hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. "I did. But we both know that's not what you really want to talk about." Her jaw tightened. "Stephen." He tilted his head, watching her like he could see straight through her. "Do you regret it?" The question caught her off guard. Her first instinct was to lie, to say yes, to tell him they should forget it ever happened. But when she opened her mouth, the truth slipped out instead.
No.
His lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't expected her honesty. Then, slowly, a grin spread across his face.
Good.
Vivian sighed, pressing her fingers to her temple. "This is a bad idea." Stephen chuckled. "Maybe. But you're still not telling me to stop."
She didn't respond.
Because she couldn't. And that silence said more than words ever could. Vivian exhaled sharply, forcing herself to look away from Stephen's knowing gaze. She hated that he could read her so easily, that he could unravel her control with just a few words. "This can't happen," she said finally, keeping her voice low but firm. Stephen leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to match hers. "It already did." Her heart stuttered. He wasn't wrong. The kiss, the moment on the terrace, the way she hadn't stopped thinking about him all weekend, it had all happened. And now, every time she looked at him, her body remembered. She pushed back her chair and stood, trying to regain the upper hand. "We need to be professional." Stephen smirked. "I can be professional." "Good," she said, moving past him toward the coffee machine. "Then let's forget about Friday night." He turned, watching her as she poured her coffee. "Is that really what you want?" Vivian gripped the cup a little too tightly. Yes, that's what she should want. But she couldn't bring herself to say it. She felt him step closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth behind her. "Vivian," he said softly, and the way he said her name, without the title, without formality, sent shivers down her spine. She turned around too quickly, nearly colliding with him. Her breath hitched as she found herself trapped between the counter and his body, her coffee forgotten in her hand. "Stephen," he reached out, brushing his fingers over the inside of her wrist, a touch so light it shouldn't have affected her, but it did. "Tell me to walk away," he murmured, his eyes dark and unreadable. "And I will."
She wanted to.
She needed to. But instead, she stood frozen, her lips parting, her pulse racing. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, until finally, Stephen let out a soft chuckle and stepped back, giving her space she hadn't even asked for. "Guess I have my answer," he said, grabbing a coffee cup for himself. Vivian closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. This was dangerous. This was inevitable. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to fight it. The rest of the day was torture. Vivian threw herself into meetings, emails, and endless paperwork, anything to avoid thinking about him. But it was impossible. Stephen was everywhere.
His voice in the hallway.
His cologne lingering in the office. The way he sat across from her in the conference room, fingers tapping absently against the table, stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. By lunchtime, she was exhausted. Her assistant, Naomi, poked her head into the office. "Would you like me to order lunch for you, ma'am?" Vivian hesitated. Normally, she'd eat at her desk, but she needed air. Distance. "No, I'll step out," she said, grabbing her coat. The cafe across the street was small and tucked away, the kind of place where she wouldn't run into colleagues. She settled into a quiet corner, hoping for a moment of peace. But peace was the last thing she got. Didn't think you'd be the type to eat alone. Her stomach clenched at the familiar voice. She looked up, and there he was, Stephen, standing at her table with that same infuriating smirk. She sighed. Do you make a habit of stalking your boss? He chuckled, pulling out the chair across from her before she could protest. I was getting coffee.
Saw you.
Thought I'd say hello. You've said it. You can go now. Stephen leaned back in his chair, studying her. You know, if you want me to stop chasing you, you should stop looking at me like that. Vivian stiffened. Like what? His smirk softened into something more dangerous, something real. Like you want me. Her pulse spiked. You're imagining things. Stephen tilted his head, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. Am I? Vivian opened her mouth to argue, but the words never came. Because the truth was, he wasn't wrong. He saw through her, through every wall she had spent years perfecting. And that scared her more than she cared to admit. She looked away, focusing on her untouched sandwich. We shouldn't do this. Stephen was quiet for a moment, then leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something low and intimate. Then tell me to stop. Vivian gripped her coffee cup, willing herself to say the words. But once again, silence betrayed her. And Stephen just smiled, because he already knew she wouldn't. The email came through late in the afternoon, buried among a dozen other HR notifications. Vivian might have skimmed past it if not for the subject line. Resignation notice, Stephen Carter. Her breath caught. She clicked on it, her pulse hammering as she read the brief, professional message. Stephen had resigned. No warning. No conversation. Just a cold, formal resignation letter stating that he was leaving to pursue private business. His last day would be in 2 weeks. Vivian sat frozen, staring at the screen. Her fingers curled into fists, emotions crashing over her in waves, shock, confusion, something dangerously close to panic. He hadn't said a word. Not after weeks of stolen glances, lingering touches, and words left unspoken. After everything, he was just leaving? A sharp knock on her office door startled her. She barely had time to mask her expression before Naomi peeked in. Ma'am, HR just informed me about Stephen's resignation. I thought you'd want to. Thank you, Naomi. Vivian cut in, her voice steady. Too steady. I've seen the email. Naomi hesitated. Do you want me to schedule an exit interview with him? Vivian clenched her jaw.
No.
Because she wasn't ready to face him.
Because she didn't know what she'd say.
Because, deep down, she already knew this wasn't just about work. She wasn't sure how long she sat there after Naomi left, staring at the resignation email as if she could will it to change. As if she could stop him from leaving. But she knew the truth. She had let fear keep her from him for too long. And now, she was about to lose him before she had even taken the chance. The office felt different after the email. It was as if the air itself had shifted, charged with an invisible weight that pressed against Vivian's chest. She moved through the rest of the day in a haze, attending meetings, signing documents, responding to emails, everything on autopilot. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, one thought kept clawing its way back. Stephen was leaving. By the time the office emptied for the evening, she had made up her mind. She wouldn't let this end in silence. That night, Stephen's apartment was on the 8th floor of a high-rise downtown. Vivian had never been there before, but she had his address. HR records made sure of that. She hesitated at the door, hand hovering over the knocker. What am I even doing here? She could still walk away. Pretend she hadn't driven across the city just to see him. Pretend she wasn't unraveling. But then the door opened. Stephen stood there, looking as if he had expected her. He was in a fitted black t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled like he had just run his fingers through it. No suit. No office formalities. Just him. Vivian's breath hitched. His eyes swept over her, taking in her stiff posture, the way she was gripping her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Then, slowly, his lips curved into that familiar, knowing smirk. Boss, he said, leaning against the doorframe. To what do I owe the pleasure? The teasing tone was a mask. She could hear it. He wasn't unaffected. She forced herself to speak. You resigned. Stephen raised a brow.
Yeah.
That's usually how it works when someone wants to leave. Her jaw clenched. And you weren't going to tell me? Something flickered in his expression. Something dark, unreadable. He stepped back, holding the door open. You should come in. Vivian hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. His apartment was warm, modern, with an open floor plan that overlooked the city skyline. A whiskey glass sat half-finished on the coffee table, next to a laptop filled with notes, plans for whatever business he was starting. She turned to face him, arms crossed.
Why?
Stephen sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Vivian, you know why. No, she said, voice firmer now. I don't. He let out a dry laugh. Because I can't stay. Because every day, I sit across from you in that office, wanting you. And every day, you pretend like this, we don't exist. Her breath caught, but he wasn't done. I thought maybe I could handle it. Thought I could be patient. But I'm done waiting for something that's never going to happen. His eyes locked onto hers, intense and unguarded. Unless you tell me I'm wrong. The silence stretched. Vivian's heart pounded, her fingers twitching at her sides. She had spent so much time convincing herself that keeping her distance was the right choice. The safe choice. But standing here, looking at him, hearing the raw honesty in his voice, she didn't want safe. She took a shaky breath, stepping closer. Stephen. His gaze flickered to her lips, then back to her eyes. Say the word, Vivian. And I'll stay. The air between them was thick, electric. And this time, when she reached for him, she didn't hesitate. Vivian's fingers curled around the front of Stephen's t-shirt, her grip tight, uncertain, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't. His breath was warm against her skin, his body so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. For the first time in months, there were no office walls, no unspoken rules between them. Just this moment. Just them. Stephen didn't move, didn't push. He was giving her control, waiting for her to decide. But his eyes, dark, patient, burning, told her everything. She swallowed, her heart hammering. If I tell you to stay, his fingers brushed against her waist, the touch featherlight. Then I will. Vivian exhaled shakily. And if I tell you this is a mistake? A sad, knowing smile tugged at his lips. Then I'll go. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. For so long, she had convinced herself that walking away was the right thing to do. That keeping her distance meant protecting herself, her career, her reputation, her heart. But as she stood there, her fingers still tangled in his shirt, she realized something. She didn't want to walk away. Not anymore. Vivian looked up, searching his face. Was she really going to do this? Stephen's hand slid up her arm, slow, reverent, like he was memorizing the feel of her. Vivian. She closed her eyes. Then, with a shaky breath, she whispered the words she had been too afraid to say. Stay. Stephen didn't hesitate. His lips were on hers in an instant, capturing her in a kiss that sent a shudder through her entire body. It wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate, just deep, deliberate, filled with every unspoken thing between them. Vivian melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest, over his shoulders. His fingers splayed against her back, pulling her closer until there was nothing between them but heat and longing. When they finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against his, their breaths mingling. Stephen let out a soft chuckle. Took you long enough. Vivian huffed a laugh, shaking her head. You're impossible. He smirked, brushing his thumb over her cheek. And you're worth the wait. She sighed, pressing a hand to his chest. This isn't going to be easy. Stephen's gaze softened. Nothing worth it ever is. Vivian looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was exactly where she was supposed to be.